where tonight we have a delightfully dark original tale penned by Stephen Sinclair. It concerns a small child, codenamed Sunbeam, who can paint anything that is or anything that was. A word of warning, however. Be careful what you ask her to paint, for the very sight of it could drive you all the way to the horror story corner. I hope you enjoy The Little Sunbeam Who Painted the Truth.
Antonov sat at his desk and drank vodka. He cleaned and reassembled his service revolver. Also, he reread the order that had come down from Brezhnev himself. He did all this mechanically and efficiently, as he did everything. What he resolutely didn't do was look at the file that senior researcher Belov had titled The Never Never Pictures. It lay, unlooked at, beside the bottle and glass. Half the order from the General Secretary had already been carried out. The order read, "Liquidate case designate Sunbeam with extreme prejudice, immediately. Senior researcher Belov is to be liquidated immediately. Extreme prejudice. All material, repeat, all material relating to case designate Sunbeam is to be destroyed. This is a priority order of the Supreme Soviet." He had shot Belov himself, although he could have ordered one of his men to do it. And he'd done this even though the man had been his friend and had fought alongside him in the great patriotic war against the fascists, even though he had loved Belov as a brother. This was part of the reason Antonov was weeping. He thought to himself, what a sight I would be if anyone looked. These tears would look either completely ridiculous or completely horrific, because they don't belong on the face of a man like me. I look exactly what I am, a peasant son of Russia, a granite-faced veteran soldier. Then again, he reflected, that's probably only what a foreigner would think. An American or Frenchman, an Englishman, my own kind, would understand all too well, and perhaps say the old proverb, "What does a Russian want with greatness when all he desires is tragedy?" The present situation was certainly tragic, he reflected. But it wasn't tragic because he had just shot his best friend, nor was it because case designate Sunbeam was a 10-year-old girl called Titania. It was tragic for very different reasons. Titania had come to the attention of the KGB over a year before, and through them to the notice of the department that was headed by Belov and himself, a department that was simply known as sensory research. Antonov was officially head of security, but as he was also KGB himself, his remit was somewhat more extensive. The girl was a resident of an orphanage. It was common knowledge that in the workers' paradise, the state orphanages were particularly hellish places. Also, that the ones where disabled and mentally ill children were warehoused were the ninth circle. This wasn't surprising in a country where even the veterans of the Great Patriotic War, who had lost limbs, were sometimes called samovars. The girl lived in one of those places in Moscow. She walked with a pronounced limp because one of her legs was slightly twisted. She was also slow, spoke and acted like a much younger child. In some ways, she was lucky. The home where she lived was one of the better ones, although this only illustrated how abominable the bad ones were. Also, she spoke and liked to speak. Many of the kids in those places stopped or were so neglected they never even learned how. Sometimes the children in the orphanage were actually given things to do, rather than left to rock back and forth. One of the orderlies had given the girl some paper and crayons and told her, "Do me some flowers," and the amazing thing had happened. The orderlies had discovered she could draw, paint, Some of them had been selling the pictures she made in Gorky Park, in one of those markets behind the bandstands. The market didn't officially exist, any more than the homeless or the prostitutes existed. The pictures were good, very good, and they had discovered something else. If you asked Titania to draw something, she would draw it. It wasn't even necessary to get rough with her. Usually she wanted to draw, wanted to paint. She could produce them very quickly. Usually she could deliver the goods, as one of them put it. One of the nurses who was involved had said paint a Siberian tiger, and the girl had. Later, it occurred to the nurse that it was a little bit strange that Titania, who couldn't read or write, had even known what such an animal was. And partly as a joke, and partly out of real curiosity, the nurse had said to the girl, "Paint me a picture of what my husband is doing." Titania had. At this time, the child sometimes couldn't, or she could, but not one of the paintings the staff at the orphanage called the good ones. Sometimes it was just a childish mess, and she couldn't understand the difference, or why the grown-ups shouted at her for one kind of picture and not another. It wasn't like as it had been after Belov had got to work and perfected what he called the process, which involved putting the child into deep hypnosis, made deeper and more stable with certain drugs, because you had to ask her to paint or draw something specific and something real. It always had to already exist, or to have existed at one time. And the times when the child couldn't had explained some of the cigarette burns on the little girl's arms, and other marks. Those marks were one of the main reasons Antonov, Belov, and the entire personnel, both military and scientific, were very happy that the staff of the State Orphanage No. 7 had been taken into this very complex, interrogated with severe methods, and then shot. Because Titania had painted the nurse's apartment, her husband and the nurse's best friend, and she'd painted a picture that left no doubt about what had been going on. Even a birthmark the man had, that was only visible when he had no trousers on. The nurse had tried to kill the man and her now former best friend, and when the police got involved, it came to the attention of the KGB. The complex where the child had been taken to live, where the staff of State Orphanage No. 7 had made their briefer visit, was located deep in and deep under the Siberian wilderness, just above the Arctic Circle. There was no way in or out, except by air, via the airbase built above it. Distance, wolves, and the cold would kill you if you tried to walk out. Not that anyone tried. The complex was ultra-modern, brightly lit, clean, and efficient, also well supplied with everything the personnel needed. In short, it was well run. In a country where the tap water sometimes came out as grey sludge, and where everything from the power supply to basic goods couldn't be guaranteed, this was not to be dismissed. Furthermore, the personnel were all the best at whatever their job was, even the permanent Soviet personnel, normally notorious for the skill with which they stole as much as possible, whilst doing as little as possible, were well motivated. This was Antonov and Belov's doing. The two men had discussed things during the war. They had decided they trusted each other. Also that the system and ideology they served belonged to a latrine trench, and that they would help each other to subvert that system by loyally serving it, whilst manipulating it from within. Together they were a formidable team, made more formidable by the fact they had long since not had to say anything out loud about what they were doing. Most of the time, anyway. They were also both too clever to confuse their actions with a desire for actual change in the system. It was entirely for their own benefit. Titania had become case designate Sunbeam, and the official and highly secret property of the Soviet state. She was very happy in the complex. Now she always had enough to eat and drink, and these were always nice things. It was also always nice and warm, not like before. Also, nobody hurt her now. Titania loved her Uncle Belov. He wanted her to draw and paint pictures in a big room, and he was always pleased with them. And she also loved her uncle Antonov, who was a big soldier man. He didn't dress like her uncle Belov, who always wore a funny white coat. In fact, she loved all the grown-ups in this place. There was always a nice lady to look after her all the time. She had a nice soft bed and lots of toys. When Belov presented her with a black kitten, her squeals of delight, her joy, had been boundless. 6 months before Antonov had stood, face impassive, at the back of the conference centre in this very complex, internally he had been grinning and laughing at the reaction of the audience as Belov gave his report, played them the film. The audience had included 3 Politburo members, 5 generals, and various scientists and party functionaries. Antonov had thought he'd spotted some of them begin to make the sign of the cross before remembering themselves. He'd found it delightful. He remembered Belov's words. This is the part of the process that I call priming. As you can see, case designate Sunbeam has been injected with nothing more than a combined stimulant and sedative, also a very mild hallucinogen. Full details are in the report before each of you. The subject has also been placed by me in a state of deep hypnosis. Prior to perfecting this part of the process, successful outcomes only occurred between 60 to 70%. As you can see, we are now up to between 80 and 90%. At Belov's signal, the projectionist restarted the film. Belov and the little girl in the room besides her living quarters, her black kitten contentedly asleep on her lap. The girl sat unmoving, face blank. The senior researcher was giving her precise instructions. In a quick, staccato voice, he used vocabulary that Titania couldn't possibly have understood. Another signal, the film stopped. Case designate Sunbeam is now primed. We now move to the second phase. The subject's psychic abilities have been deliberately focused through subconscious means. They are in a kind of latency. The next stage is activation. Before we move to activation, I would like to thank our political officer. He helped us select those non-sensitive samples of Sunbeam's finished work to show to Soviet artists, psychologists, and other experts. This revealed one of the most interesting subsidiary results. They all agreed that the individual brushstrokes and so on reveal the kind of technique, if it can be even termed this at all, found among very small children, severely impaired adults, and those individuals with poor muscle tone and coordination. Exactly how these translate into the clear and remarkable results Sunbeam produces was and is something they could not agree upon. Both Antonov and Belov hated the Commissar. Both knew how to manipulate him. Fear and vanity. We now move to activation. On the film, the child played happily with Belov. They played with a ball. Quietly, in simple language, he told her what he wanted her to paint. She was pleased and laughed happily. Titania loved her cat and liked to paint him, and she loved Belov. The animal was taken from the subject and placed in a room with a copy of the test image on the wall behind it. As a control, animals of the same kind were placed in other rooms, with both the same picture and various others. I especially ask you to note that as another control case designate, Sunbeam was given no relevant information. Then case designate Sunbeam was asked to paint the animal and where it was. On the screen, the child painted. She was very happy and at ease. She and her uncle Belov were playing a game with her cat. It took Titania about half an hour. How this was even possible was the least remarkable thing. On the screen they watched as she painted her cat asleep on the floor of a room, empty, except for a huge copy of Rembrandt's The Night Watch on the wall behind the sleeping animal. In Titania's picture, she had reproduced this exactly. Rembrandt had been the test image. As an example of so-called distance painting, this was a remarkable example, as I'm sure you'll all agree. But even more useful and extraordinary results were soon obtained. The same process, but this time Belov asks Titania to paint the room where he's going to take her cat the next day. As a control, there are 4 rooms. Only one of these has a copy of a picture in it. In this case, Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. She paints this. This is a successful result. On the screen, Antonov and Belov walk into Titania's room. Antonov gives her back her cat. She hugs the big soldier man and gets him the childish picture she's made, giggling at his thanks. 2 men holding the hands of a little girl. She'd included the cat. We now move to our most important results, which I have designated as field tests. Again, I would like to thank our political officer for his help. His tireless work liaising with the Central Committee has been invaluable. The first field test had elicited cheers from the audience, rapturous applause. It had been difficult to get Vietnamese cooperation without interference from the Chinese, as it always was, but it had been done. Case designate Sunbeam had painted a picture of a jungle clearing, also a series of dates and numbers. Although Titania couldn't understand things like that, any more than she could read or write. It was the date, time, and map coordinates of where one of the American Sweep and Destroy patrol missions would be 2 weeks before they were. The NVA and the Viet Cong had been waiting for them. The Americans had suffered 80% casualties. Any more would have aroused suspicion. In a corner of the painting Titania had made, there had been a strange thing. In the Julian alphabet, she'd written something that was later apparently found on one of the GI's bodies, a diary entry. "I love you, Mum. I was killed." But it was the second field test that had made some of them nearly bless themselves. More map coordinates for the city of Tel Aviv. In the painting, the huge silo under the city could be clearly seen. In huge Hebrew letters, on its mile-long floor, the words, "Never again." Tier on tier they rose and disappeared into the distance. Apparently, the Joshua-class missiles could reach anywhere on the planet several times over. She had also drawn schematics for the Gomorrah thermonuclear warheads, each of these at least several thousand times as powerful as the American one that had destroyed Hiroshima. Some prejudices were far stronger and older than communism. Antonov had heard one to the general's mutter. Only they would put it under there. Now no one can give them what's coming to them, even if they don't launch a big dirty bomb. Later, Belov had continued. Obvious questions are raised. What kind of phenomena are we dealing with? Personally, I find terms like supernatural or paranormal politically unsound. Also, they are simply bad, from a utilitarian and semantic point of view. I have discussed this with our brilliant political officer. I prefer my own term from one of my books on folklore. The General Secretary was kind enough to write the introduction to the one I have in mind. The rare normal phenomena. A phenomenon which will one day be completely explained by sound Marxists, Leninist science. I wish to emphasize this point. It refers to purely mechanistic factors, but these occur so rarely and at such wide, extenuated points in space and time that we don't yet understand them. In case designate Sunbeam, we have captured one of these phenomena for the Soviet people. More applause and congratulations, and Antonov knew that Belov had gone on to lie to them, but only about things that didn't matter and for everyone's good. Firstly, he told them that comfortable conditions for the test subject improved the results. They didn't, but why not get a good deal out of these pigs for the girl? They had both grown fond of her. What difference did it make? Secondly, he got the fools to believe that she suffered from what he described as psychic exhaustion after the process. This would let them control the information they let the idiots have. They had taken the girl for a walk round the base perimeter, and he'd asked, "What if they want something like the American launch codes?" Psychic exhaustion was the answer. Or part of an answer. Chief researcher Belov had also mixed the lies with truth. It was true that the girl's mental condition meant that she would be virtually impossible to turn by a foreign power. Above all, he dangled more amazing things before them. Belov had always been interested in folklore. In the war, he had kept them amused with the old stories. He had been clever enough to make his hobby politically and ideologically sound. His particular interest was in supernatural beings, and when he wrote, he emphasized that they were bound for the dustbin of history alongside capitalism, or rather any vestige of belief in them. He said they were an example of imperialism in cultural imagination, but he wasn't afraid to assert that he thought they were amusing. All this made people think him a good robust communist, while giving them an excuse to enjoy it as well. His theory of the rare normal had party sanction. Besides, it was just a hobby. All men are sometimes tempted beyond what's called common sense. About 5 weeks ago, he went to Titania and told her to paint him a fire-breathing dragon. Nothing happened. The girl could only produce what was real, or had once been real. Already, he had given her a series of instructions to paint a man lying on his deathbed, also the people who had been in the room. The man had been called Napoleon Bonaparte, and Sunbeam had done as he'd asked. But he said the names of other things, and she painted them, and when he closed his eyes he could see those things. One of the worst had been a thing with red eyes, and a clown-white face, long teeth, and hands that seemed to reach from the canvas. But not the worst. When he saw that one, he began to go mad. It was as simple as that. He hadn't told Antonov what he was doing. Belov had gone completely insane. One day in the canteen, he started to rave and weep. They were wrong, so wrong. He had said the most terrible things, screamed that they should build a church on the blood, on the place we murdered the little father and his family. And that was the least of what he said. The political officer had been apoplectic with rage, ordered Belov arrested. The political officer was now dead. He had looked in the Never Never file and shot himself. Antonov had looked, and what he found made everything a tragedy. He and Belov should have fought them long ago. Them. And got out. No, they should have tried to destroy them. Been the good Russian men that a certain woman had waited for in vain to come to a house of special purpose to save her and her family. Now he was going to try and save Titania, and they would probably kill them both. But he would try. He didn't blame Belov. It had just been too much for him. For Sunbeam had painted a picture of Vladimir Lenin, and whispering into his left ear the ghostly but unmistakable form of a demon.
Well, what an ending. Unexpected, certainly. So what became of the little Sunbeam, of Antonov, and, of course, the little cat? Did they escape? Did Titania spend the rest of her days painting rainbows and pleasant scenes? What do you think? I could tell you, or you could just take a peek into the horror story corner. Thank you for listening, and as ever, sleep well.